The autumn wind swept through the small town of Cedar Falls, Ohio, carrying with it the scent of burning leaves and the distant hum of engines. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where Sunday dinners lasted until the stars came out, and where reputation was currency more valuable than gold. Richard Coleman had lived here all his 62 years, building his hardware store from a single room into the largest supplier in 3 counties. He was a man of routines, of principles carved in stone, and of expectations that his only daughter, Emma, would follow the path he had carefully paved for her. Emma was 23 that autumn, fresh out of college with a degree in nursing and a heart full of dreams that didn't quite match her father's blueprints. She had her mother's eyes, a shade of green that reminded Richard of spring mornings, and her grandmother's stubborn chin. Margaret, Richard's wife, often said that Emma was the best parts of both of them mixed together, though Richard sometimes wondered if that stubbornness would be her undoing. The Coleman house sat at the end of Maple Street, a 2-story Victorian with a wraparound porch that Richard had rebuilt with his own hands. Every Sunday the family gathered there, the smell of Margaret's roast filling every corner, the sound of laughter echoing through rooms that had witnessed 3 generations of Colemans. It was on one of those Sundays that everything changed. Emma arrived late that afternoon, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her smile wider than Richard had seen in months. She helped her mother set the table, humming a song he didn't recognize, and when they finally sat down to eat, Richard noticed something different about his daughter. There was a lightness in her movements, a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "You seem happy," Margaret observed, passing the mashed potatoes. Emma's smile grew. "I am, Mom. I really am." Richard watched his daughter carefully. He had learned over the years to read people, to notice the small things that others missed. It was what made him a good businessman. And right now, every instinct told him that whatever was making Emma happy was something he wouldn't approve of. "Met someone?" he asked, keeping his voice casual. Emma hesitated just for a second, but it was enough. "Actually, yes, his name is Jake." The name hung in the air like smoke. Richard set down his fork. "Jake who?" "Jake Morrison." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken words. Richard knew that name. Everyone in Cedar Falls knew that name. Jake Morrison was the vice president of the Iron Brotherhood, a motorcycle club that operated out of the old warehouse on the edge of town. They were the kind of men that decent folks crossed the street to avoid, the kind that mothers warned their daughters about, the kind that Richard had spent his entire life keeping away from his family. "The biker," Richard said, the word coming out like something bitter. Emma's jaw tightened. "He's more than that, Dad." "Is he?" "Because from what I've seen, those men are nothing but trouble. They ride through town like they own it, making noise, disturbing the peace. Half of them have probably seen the inside of a jail cell. You don't know him. I don't need to know him. I know his type." Margaret reached across the table, placing her hand on Richard's arm. "Richard, maybe we should—" "No, Margaret. This is exactly what I was afraid of." He turned to Emma, his voice firm. "I forbid you from seeing him." Emma's eyes widened. "You what?" "You heard me. I will not have my daughter associating with someone like that. You have a future, Emma, a good future, and I won't watch you throw it away on some leather-wearing delinquent who thinks a motorcycle makes him a man." The words cut through the air like shards of glass. Emma stood slowly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "I'm 23 years old, Dad. You can't forbid me from anything. As long as you live under my roof, then maybe I won't live under your roof anymore." She grabbed her coat from the hook by the door, her movements quick and deliberate. Margaret stood, tears already forming in her eyes. "Emma, please, let's talk about this." But Emma was already at the door, her hand on the knob. She turned one last time, looking at her father with an expression that broke something inside him, though he would never admit it. "I thought you would at least try to understand. I thought you would trust me to make my own choices. But I guess I was wrong about you too." The door closed behind her, and Richard was left standing in the silence, his dinner growing cold, his heart hardening with every passing second. He told himself he was doing the right thing. He told himself that someday Emma would thank him. He told himself that a father's job was to protect his daughter, even from herself. He had no idea how wrong he was. The weeks that followed were the longest of Richard's life. Emma moved out, renting a small apartment above the bakery on Main Street. She continued her work at the county hospital, and though she still called her mother every few days, she refused to speak to her father. Richard threw himself into his work, spending longer hours at the store, avoiding the empty chair at the dinner table, pretending that the silence didn't echo louder than any words could. Margaret tried to bridge the gap, but every attempt ended the same way. Richard would listen, his jaw set, his arms crossed, and then he would shake his head and change the subject. In his mind, he was waiting. Waiting for Emma to come to her senses, to realize that her father had been right all along, to come home with an apology and a promise to do better. But Emma didn't come home. And as the months passed, the distance between them grew wider than any road could measure. It was Margaret who told Richard about the wedding. She came to him one evening in December, the first snow of the season falling gently outside, and placed a simple white envelope on his workbench. He didn't need to open it to know what it was. "She's getting married," Margaret said softly. "In the spring." Richard stared at the envelope like it was a coiled snake. "To him?" "To Jake, yes." "And she thinks I'm going to attend? After everything?" Margaret's eyes, so much like Emma's, filled with sadness. "She hopes you will. We both do." Richard picked up the envelope, feeling its weight in his hands. Such a small thing to carry so much meaning. He turned it over, saw Emma's handwriting on the front, and felt something crack inside his chest. "I can't, Margaret. I can't watch my daughter make the biggest mistake of her life and pretend to celebrate it." Margaret took a deep breath. "Then you'll lose her, Richard, for good. Maybe I already have." He set the envelope down, unopened, and went back to his work. Margaret stood there for a long moment, watching her husband retreat into himself, and then she quietly left the workshop, the invitation still lying on the bench like an unanswered prayer. The wedding happened on a Saturday in May, the kind of day that poets write about, all blue skies and gentle breezes and flowers blooming in every garden. Richard spent that day in his store, reorganizing shelves that didn't need organizing, counting inventory he had counted the day before. When 6 o'clock came and the church bells rang across town, he stood at his window, looking toward the old stone chapel on the hill, and tried to convince himself that he didn't care. He failed. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. If you believe that every family deserves a second chance, that love can heal even the deepest wounds, then join us. Subscribe now, because this story is far from over. Began 3 years later, on a winter morning that Richard would remember for the rest of his life. The hardware store was quiet that Tuesday, the kind of slow day that made Richard restless. He was behind the counter, reviewing order forms, when the bell above the door chimed. He looked up, expecting old Tom Patterson or maybe one of the Johnson boys looking for supplies. What he saw instead stopped his heart. A woman stood in the doorway, a child balanced on her hip. The woman was Emma, older now, her hair longer, her face carrying the soft lines of motherhood. But it was the child that Richard couldn't look away from. A little girl, maybe 2 years old, with curly brown hair and the brightest green eyes he had ever seen. His wife's eyes, his mother's eyes, his daughter's eyes. "Hello, Dad," Emma said. The words hung in the air, fragile as snowflakes. Richard gripped the counter, steadying himself. 3 years. 3 years of silence, of missed holidays, of photographs he'd only seen through Margaret's tearful descriptions. And now, here she was, standing in his store like no time had passed at all. Emma. She walked toward him slowly, the child watching him with curious, unafraid eyes. When she reached the counter, she set the little girl down, and the girl immediately grabbed onto her mother's leg, peeking out at the stranger before her. "This is Lily," Emma said. "Your granddaughter." Richard felt the word hit him like a physical blow. Granddaughter. He had a granddaughter, a beautiful, innocent child who had lived 2 years without knowing him, without being held by him, without hearing him tell her stories about her grandmother's garden or her great-grandfather's fishing trips. "She has your mother's eyes," he said, his voice rough. Emma nodded. "She has her father's stubbornness." Richard flinched at the mention of Jake, but he forced himself to look at his daughter. Really look at her. She wasn't the angry young woman who had stormed out of his house 3 years ago. She was a mother now, a wife, someone who had built a life without him. And despite everything, despite all his fears and predictions, she looked happy, genuinely, deeply happy. "Why are you here?" he asked, though the question sounded harsher than he intended. Emma took a breath. "Because Mom called. She told me you've been sick." Richard waved his hand dismissively. "A little pneumonia." "Nothing serious. Pneumonia at 65 is serious, Dad. I'm fine. You always say that." They stood in silence, the only sound the ticking of the old clock above the door. Lily had found a display of colorful tape rolls and was examining them with intense fascination. Richard watched her, this tiny person who carried his blood, his legacy, and felt something shift inside him. Something he had kept locked away for 3 years. How is he?" Richard asked, the words like gravel in his throat. Emma seemed surprised by the question. "Jake? He's good. He's actually why I'm here." Richard's defenses went up immediately. "What does he want?" "He wants to meet you, properly." "And why would I agree to that?" Emma stepped closer, her voice softening. "Because he's not who you think he is, Dad. He never was. And because life is short and grudges are heavy, and I don't want Lily to grow up not knowing her grandfather." Richard looked at his granddaughter, who had now moved on to examining the key display. She picked up a brass key, holding it up to the light like it was made of gold. "Pretty," she said, her first word to him. And just like that, the wall he had built began to crack. "One meeting," Richard said finally. "That's all I'm agreeing to." Emma smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like she had as a little girl, when he used to carry her on his shoulders through this very store. "That's all we're asking." The meeting happened 2 days later, at the small diner on the corner of Main and Oak. Richard arrived early, taking a booth in the back where he could watch the door. He ordered coffee, black, and waited, his hands wrapped around the warm mug like it was a lifeline. Jake Morrison walked in at exactly noon. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing jeans and a simple flannel shirt. No leather jacket, Richard noticed. No patches or chains or any of the things he had expected. Just a regular man, walking toward him with a calm, steady stride. "Mr. Coleman," Jake said, extending his hand. "Thank you for meeting me." Richard shook it, noting the firm grip, the calloused palms of someone who worked with his hands. "Sit down." Jake slid into the booth across from him, and for a moment, neither man spoke. They sized each other up, two people who had been enemies in the abstract finally meeting in the flesh. "I'm not going to apologize for loving your daughter," Jake said finally. "I did then, and I do now, more than anything." Richard studied him. "Then what are you here for?" "To show you who I am, not who you think I am." "And who are you?" Jake leaned back, his expression open, unguarded. "I'm a mechanic. I own a shop on the east side of town, fix cars and bikes for people who can't afford dealer prices. I volunteer at the Veterans Center on weekends. I coach Little League in the summer." He paused. "And yes, I'm a member of the Iron Brotherhood, but that club isn't what you think it is." Richard's jaw tightened. "I know exactly what motorcycle clubs are." "Do you?" "Because the Iron Brotherhood was founded by veterans, men who came home from overseas and couldn't find their place in the world anymore. We ride together, we support each other, and we give back to our community. We run charity events, we escort children with serious illnesses to their treatments, we help families who have lost everything." Jake's voice was steady, not defensive, just honest. "We're not criminals, Mr. Coleman. We're brothers." Richard didn't respond. He thought about all the assumptions he had made, all the judgments he had passed based on leather jackets and loud engines. He thought about the stories he had told himself, the villains he had created in his mind. 3 years ago," Jake continued, "you told Emma that I was trouble, that I would ruin her life, and I understood why you thought that. I did. Because from the outside, men like me don't look like the kind of people you want your daughter to marry." He leaned forward. "But in 3 years, I have never raised my voice to her. I have never made her feel less than she is. I work every day to give her and Lily a good life, and I will keep doing that until the day I die." Richard's throat felt tight. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. He slid it across the table. Richard picked it up, his hands trembling slightly. It was a picture of Emma and Lily, sitting on the steps of a modest but well-kept house. Emma was laughing at something off camera, her arms wrapped around Lily, who was wearing a tiny dress covered in sunflowers. Behind them, a garden bloomed with flowers of every color, and a dog, some kind of mutt with floppy ears, sat beside them like a guardian. "That's our home," Jake said. "That's our life. I built that porch with my own hands. Emma planted that garden, and every morning I wake up grateful that she chose me, even when her own father thought I wasn't good enough." Richard stared at the photograph, at the happiness radiating from it, and felt the last of his resistance begin to crumble. "I was afraid," he admitted, the words coming out before he could stop them. "I was afraid of losing her, and in trying to protect her, I lost her anyway." Jake nodded slowly. "It's not too late, Mr. Coleman. Lily asks about you. She sees the other kids at daycare with their grandparents, and she asks why she doesn't have one. Emma tells her that you're busy, that you love her even though you're far away. But we both know that's not the whole truth." Richard set down the photograph, his eyes burning. "I've been a fool. Maybe, but fools can change. That's what makes us human." They sat in silence for a long moment, the diner bustling around them, life continuing on as it always did. Finally, Richard looked up at the man his daughter had married, the man he had condemned without knowing, and saw him clearly for the first time. "I'd like to meet my granddaughter properly," Richard said, "if that's still possible." Jake smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Come to dinner on Sunday. Emma's making her mother's roast." Richard felt something bloom in his chest, something warm and terrifying and wonderful all at once. "I'll be there." Opened on a Sunday afternoon that smelled of rosemary and home, Richard stood on the porch of Jake and Emma's house, a bottle of wine in one hand and a stuffed elephant in the other. He had spent an hour at the toy store, wandering the aisles like a lost man, until a kind sales associate had gently guided him toward the elephants. "Little girls love elephants," she had said. "Trust me." Now, standing before the door, Richard wondered if he should have bought something bigger, or smaller, or different entirely. He had no idea what 2-year-olds liked. He had no idea how to be a grandfather. He had no idea how to fix 3 years of silence with a stuffed animal and a bottle of wine. The door opened before he could knock. Emma stood there, an apron tied around her waist, her face carrying an expression he couldn't quite read. "You came," she said. "I said I would." She studied him for a moment, and then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. Richard froze, the wine and the elephant awkward in his hands, and then he melted into the embrace, holding his daughter for the first time in 3 years. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, Emma." "I know, Dad. I know." They stood like that for a long moment, father and daughter, the years falling away between them. When they finally pulled apart, Emma's eyes were wet, but she was smiling. "Come inside. Lily's been asking about you all morning." The house was warm, filled with the smell of cooking food and the sound of a child's laughter. Jake was in the living room, Lily on his shoulders, both of them giggling at some private joke. When they saw Richard, Jake set Lily down and gave Richard a nod. "Welcome to our home, Mr. Coleman." "Richard, please." Jake smiled. "Richard." Lily stood between her parents, looking up at the tall stranger with curious eyes. She was wearing a dress with little flowers on it, her curly hair pulled back with a pink ribbon. Richard knelt down slowly, bringing himself to her level. "Hello, Lily. I'm your grandfather." Lily tilted her head, considering this information. "Grandpa?" Richard's heart nearly stopped. "That's right, Grandpa." He held out the stuffed elephant, suddenly feeling foolish. What if she didn't like elephants? What if she was scared of him? What if... Lily's face lit up like Christmas morning. She grabbed the elephant, hugging it to her chest, and then she did something that Richard would remember for the rest of his life. She walked forward and wrapped her tiny arms around his neck. "Thank you, Grandpa." Richard held her, this small, perfect person, and felt tears sliding down his cheeks. He didn't try to stop them. Some tears needed to fall. Dinner was everything Richard had forgotten Sunday dinners could be. The food was delicious, the conversation easy, and Lily entertained them all with stories about her daycare and her dog, whose name was apparently Biscuit. Jake talked about his shop, about the customers who had become friends, about the charity ride the Brotherhood was planning for next month. Emma talked about her work at the hospital, about the patients who had touched her heart, about the life she was building in this town she loved. And Richard listened, really listened. He saw his daughter through new eyes, saw the woman she had become, the mother, the wife, the person who had chosen her own path and walked it with courage. He saw Jake, not as the biker he had feared, but as the man who loved his daughter completely, who had given her a home and a family and a future. Pause this video for a moment. If you have ever felt your heart break and heal in the same breath, leave a comment right now saying, "Family is who shows up." Because that is exactly what Richard was learning, and it is a truth that every single one of us needs to hear. After dinner, Jake took Richard out to the garage to show him his workshop. Motorcycles lined the walls, some finished, some in various states of repair. Tools hung in neat rows, everything organized with military precision. "You served," Richard said, noticing a photograph on the wall. A younger Jake in uniform, surrounded by other soldiers. 2 tours in Afghanistan. "Came back with more demons than I knew what to do with." Jake leaned against a workbench. "The Brotherhood saved my life, Richard. Not in some dramatic movie way, just by being there, by giving me purpose, by reminding me that I wasn't alone." Richard looked at the photograph, at the faces of young men who had seen things no one should have to see. "I had no idea. Most people don't. They see the bikes, the jackets, and they make assumptions. I don't blame them. I used to make the same assumptions myself." Jake picked up a wrench, turning it in his hands. "But then I learned that people are more than what they look like. That the scariest-looking guy in the room might be the first one to give you the shirt off his back. That courage comes in all kinds of packages." Richard nodded slowly. "Emma told me about the charity rides. The children you help. We call them angels. Kids fighting battles no child should have to fight. We escort them to their treatments, make them feel like superheroes for a day. Some of them," Jake's voice caught, "some of them don't make it. But the ones who do, they remember. They remember that a bunch of rough-looking bikers showed up when no one else did." Richard thought about all the years he had wasted, all the assumptions he had made. He thought about the father he had been and the grandfather he wanted to become. "I was wrong about you," he said. "I was wrong about everything." Jake set down the wrench. "You were trying to protect your daughter, that's what fathers do. But I hurt her instead." "Yeah, you did." Jake's voice was gentle, without accusation. "But you're here now. That's what matters." Richard extended his hand. "Thank you. For loving her when I wasn't there to." Jake shook it firmly. "Thank you for raising the woman I love." They stood there in the garage, 2 men who had been strangers, who had been enemies, finding common ground in the only thing that truly mattered. The woman they both loved and the family they were building together. Began with the changing of seasons and the deepening of bonds. Over the following months, Richard became a regular presence in his daughter's life. He showed up for Sunday dinners, for Lily's daycare recitals, for backyard barbecues where the Iron Brotherhood gathered to share food and stories. He watched Jake with the other members, saw the respect they had for him, the way they looked out for each other like family. Margaret cried the first time she saw the photograph of Richard holding Lily on his lap, both of them laughing at something Jake had said. She hung it on the refrigerator, right next to the wedding invitation that Richard had finally opened, 3 years too late. "Better late than never," she said, kissing his cheek. Richard threw himself into being a grandfather with the same intensity he had once applied to his business. He learned Lily's favorite songs, her favorite books, her favorite way to eat pancakes, which apparently involved more syrup than Richard thought humanly possible. He attended her 3rd birthday party, surrounded by bikers and their families, and felt like he belonged in a way he hadn't felt in years. But it was one particular Saturday that changed everything. The Iron Brotherhood was hosting a charity ride for a local family whose son had been diagnosed with a rare illness. The boy, Marcus, was 7 years old, and the medical bills had devastated his parents. The Brotherhood had organized a ride to raise money, and the entire town was invited to participate. "You should come," Jake said to Richard over coffee one morning. "See what we actually do." Richard hesitated. The idea of riding with a motorcycle club still made something uncomfortable stir in his chest. But then he thought about Marcus, about his parents, about the fear they must be feeling. "I don't have a motorcycle," he said. Jake grinned. "You can ride with me." And that was how Richard Coleman, hardware store owner and former skeptic, found himself on the back of a Harley-Davidson, surrounded by 100 bikers, riding through Cedar Falls to raise money for a sick child. The ride began at the old warehouse that served as the Brotherhood's headquarters. Richard arrived early, nervous in a way he hadn't been since his wedding day. He was wearing jeans and a leather jacket that Emma had bought him, insisting that he would need it. Around him, bikers were checking their machines, greeting each other with handshakes and hugs, their voices a low rumble of anticipation. "Grandpa!" Richard turned to see Lily running toward him, Emma close behind. The little girl was wearing a tiny leather vest, clearly a gift from the club with patches that said Princess and Future Rider. Richard scooped her up, laughing. "Look at you, you're a real biker now." Lily beamed. "Uncle Tank made it for me." Richard looked over at a massive man with a beard that reached his chest. Tank waved, his smile surprisingly gentle. "She's got good taste," Tank called out. "Knows quality when she sees it." Jake appeared beside them, his bike gleaming in the morning sun. "Ready?" Richard looked at the motorcycle, at the gathering crowd, at the little boy in a wheelchair near the front, his parents standing beside him with tear-streaked faces. "Ready," he said. The ride through Cedar Falls was something Richard would never forget. 100 motorcycles moving as one, engines thundering in harmony, the town turning out to watch and wave and cheer. People lined the streets, holding signs, throwing donations into buckets that volunteers carried along the route. Children pointed and laughed, their faces bright with wonder. And in the middle of it all was Marcus, riding in a specially modified sidecar attached to the lead bike, a helmet on his head, and the biggest smile on his face. His parents rode in a car behind them, watching their son experience something magical, something that transcended illness and fear and the harsh realities of life. At the end of the route, the Brotherhood presented the family with a check. Richard didn't hear the exact amount, but he heard the mother's sob, the father's broken thank you, and he understood that it was enough. More than enough. Jake found him after the ceremony, standing apart from the crowd, watching as Marcus's parents held their son tight. "This is what we do," Jake said. "This is who we are." Richard nodded, unable to speak. He thought about all the years he had wasted judging these men, fearing them, assuming the worst. He thought about the father he had been, and the father he wished he could have been. "I want to help," he said finally. "Really help. Not just show up, but be part of this." Jake studied him for a moment, then smiled. "There's a board meeting next week. We could use someone who knows business, who knows this community, someone who can help us do more." Richard thought about his hardware store, about the life he had built, about the legacy he wanted to leave. "I'd be honored." And just like that, Richard Coleman became a member of something larger than himself, arrived with the first frost of winter and a phone call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday evening when Richard's phone rang. He was at the store, closing up for the night, his mind already on the Brotherhood meeting scheduled for the next day. When he saw Jake's name on the screen, he smiled. "Jake, what's—" "Richard." Jake's voice was tight, strained. "There's been an accident." The world stopped. Richard gripped the counter, his knuckles white. "Emma? Lily? They're okay. They're okay." Jake took a shaky breath. "It's Marcus, the boy from the ride. He's in the hospital. His condition, it's gotten worse. The doctors are saying—" He didn't need to finish. Richard understood. "What can we do? The family's falling apart. The father, Daniel, he's blaming himself, saying he should have done more, worked harder, found better doctors. He's talking about giving up." Richard thought about the little boy in the wheelchair, the joy on his face during the ride, the way his parents had clung to each other. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. The hospital was quiet when Richard arrived, the halls lit with the soft glow of fluorescent lights. He found the waiting room on the 3rd floor where a small group had gathered. Jake was there, along with Tank and several other members of the Brotherhood. Emma sat in a corner, her eyes red from crying, Lily asleep in her arms. Daniel sat apart from everyone, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. His wife, Maria, stood at the window, staring out at nothing, her face a mask of exhaustion and grief. Richard approached Daniel slowly, sitting down in the chair beside him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. "I don't know how to do this," Daniel whispered. I don't know how to watch my son. I can't. Richard thought about his own failures as a father, the years he had wasted, the chances he had missed, the stubborn pride that had almost cost him his daughter. I made a mistake once, Richard said quietly. The biggest mistake of my life. I let fear and pride convince me that I knew best, that I had all the answers, and it almost destroyed my family. Daniel looked up, his eyes hollow. But I got a second chance, Richard continued. I'm sitting here today because someone gave me grace I didn't deserve, because people believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. He placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder. Your son needs you to believe, not in miracles, not in guarantees, just in the possibility that today is not the end. Daniel's breath caught. What if it is? What if he doesn't? Then you'll be there. You'll hold his hand and tell him how much you love him, and you'll make sure his last memory is of his father's strength, not his father's surrender. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Daniel straightened slowly, wiping his eyes. I don't know if I can be that strong. Richard looked across the room at Jake, at Emma, at the brothers who had become his family. You don't have to be strong alone. That's what I've learned. Strength isn't about carrying the weight by yourself. It's about letting others help carry it with you. Tank walked over, his massive frame somehow comforting rather than intimidating. The whole club is here, brother. Whatever you need, whatever Marcus needs, we're not going anywhere. Maria turned from the window, tears streaming down her face. She walked to her husband, taking his hand, and together they stood, broken but not defeated. Can we see him? Daniel asked the nurse who had just appeared. Yes. He's been asking for you. As the family disappeared down the hallway, Richard felt Emma's hand slip into his. She stood beside him, Lily still sleeping against her shoulder. That was beautiful, Dad, she whispered. Richard shook his head. I just told him what I wish someone had told me. What Jake told me, in his own way. That it's never too late to choose differently. They stood together, father and daughter, watching the hallway where a family was learning to hold on to hope. Marcus made it through the night, and the night after that, and slowly, painfully, he began to improve. The doctors couldn't explain it. They talked about the power of the human spirit, about the importance of support systems, about how love sometimes defied medical probability. Richard visited often, bringing toys for Marcus, coffee for his parents, and the quiet, steady presence that he had once been too proud to offer. He watched Daniel transform from a broken man into a fighter, someone who advocated for his son with the same intensity that Richard had once applied to keeping his daughter from love. And through it all, the brotherhood was there. They organized meal trains, set up a fund for future treatments, even arranged for Marcus to sit on a real motorcycle, parked safely in the parking lot, while the whole club revved their engines in salute. Thank you, Daniel said to Richard one afternoon, as Marcus slept peacefully in his bed. For what you said that night. It changed something in me. Richard smiled. We all need someone to remind us who we can be. I'm just glad I could be that person for you. Opened on a spring morning, 1 year after Richard had first met his granddaughter. The Coleman hardware store was celebrating its 40th anniversary, and the entire town had turned out. Tables were set up in the parking lot, covered with food and flowers and photographs spanning 4 decades. A banner hung across the entrance. 40 years of serving Cedar Falls. But for Richard, the real celebration was something else entirely. He stood on the small stage that had been erected for the occasion, looking out at the crowd. His wife Margaret was in the front row, her face glowing with pride. Beside her sat Emma, Jake, and Lily, who was now 3 years old and insisted on wearing her biker vest everywhere she went. Behind them, spread out across the parking lot, were the members of the Iron Brotherhood. Tank, who had become one of Richard's closest friends. The veterans who had served overseas and found peace in the rumble of engines. The families who had been helped by the club's charity work. The community that Richard had once judged from a distance and now embraced as his own. 40 years, Richard began, his voice carrying across the crowd. 40 years of hammers and nails, of broken pipes and leaky faucets, of neighbors helping neighbors build something that would last. He paused, looking at his daughter. But if I'm honest, the most important thing I've built wasn't this store. It was learning how to be a better father, a better man. And that's something I didn't do on my own. He gestured to Jake, who stood and joined him on the stage. 5 years ago, I made a decision I'm not proud of. I judged a man by his appearance, by the motorcycle he rode, by the leather he wore. I told my daughter she couldn't love him. I was wrong. A murmur went through the crowd. Richard felt his throat tighten, but he pressed on. Jake Morrison taught me that strength and kindness aren't opposites. That courage isn't about being loud, it's about showing up when it matters. That family isn't just about blood, it's about choice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Jake, I've been working on something. Something I should have given you a long time ago. He opened the box to reveal a key, old and brass, hanging on a leather cord. This was my father's key. The first key to the first door of this store. He gave it to me on my wedding day and told me that a man's legacy isn't what he builds, it's who he loves. Richard pressed the key into Jake's hand. Welcome to the family, officially. Jake looked at the key, then at Richard, his eyes bright with emotion. He pulled the older man into an embrace, and the crowd erupted in applause. When they finally pulled apart, Emma was there, Lily in her arms. Grandpa gave Daddy a present, Lily announced to everyone who would listen. Richard laughed, scooping his granddaughter up. That's right, sweetheart. And you know what? Grandpa has a present for you, too. He reached behind the stage and pulled out a child-sized rocking chair, handcrafted from oak, with her name carved into the back. Made it myself, he said, for when you come to visit. Lily's eyes went wide. She hugged the chair like it was a treasure, and Richard felt his heart overflow. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and the stars began to appear, Richard sat on his porch with Jake, 2 beers sweating in the warm night air. Thank you, Jake said quietly. For everything. Richard shook his head. I should be thanking you. You showed me what I'd been missing. You showed me that love doesn't fit in boxes, that people are more than their appearances, that sometimes the best thing a father can do is get out of the way and trust his daughter to make her own choices. They sat in comfortable silence, the sounds of the night settling around them. Can I ask you something? Richard said finally. Anything. That first day, at the diner. Why did you agree to meet me? After everything I said, everything I did. Why didn't you just walk away? Jake took a long sip of his beer, considering the question. Because Emma believed you could change. And because I've learned that people deserve second chances. I was given one when I came home from overseas, lost and angry and looking for a fight. The Brotherhood gave me purpose. They gave me family. And now, he smiled. Now, I have another family. A bigger one. Richard felt tears prick his eyes. I don't deserve any of this. Maybe not. But that's the thing about grace, Richard. It's not about deserving. It's about receiving. And passing it on. They clinked their bottles together, father and son-in-law, 2 men who had once been strangers finding their way to something that looked a lot like home. The final scene took place 1 week later at the annual Iron Brotherhood Charity Gala. The old warehouse had been transformed into something magical. Twinkle lights hung from the rafters, tables were draped in white cloth, and a band played in the corner while couples swayed on the dance floor. Children ran between the adults, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Richard stood at the entrance, watching it all with wonder. Margaret was beside him, her hand in his, her smile the same one that had captured his heart 42 years ago. It's beautiful, she said. It really is. Emma approached them, radiant in a simple blue dress, Jake at her side. Between them, holding both their hands, was Lily, now wearing a tiny dress that matched her mother's. Dance with me, Grandpa? Lily asked, tugging at his hand. Richard laughed. I don't know, sweetheart. Grandpa's not much of a dancer. Please? How could he say no? He let his granddaughter lead him to the dance floor, where they swayed awkwardly but happily to a slow song. Around them, the Brotherhood and their families danced and laughed and celebrated, a community built on choice rather than circumstance. Marcus was there too, still in his wheelchair but stronger than he had been a year ago. His parents watched him with eyes full of hope, their hands intertwined. Tank stood near the buffet, defending the dessert table from a group of children who had clearly developed a strategy for overwhelming his defenses. He caught Richard's eye and winked. And in the middle of it all, Jake and Emma danced together, lost in their own world, Two people who had chosen love over fear and been rewarded with everything. When the song ended, Richard lifted Lily into his arms and held her tight. "I love you, Grandpa," she said. "I love you too, sweetheart, more than you'll ever know." He looked around at the warehouse, at the people who had become his family, at the life that had blossomed from the ruins of his own stubbornness. And he understood finally what Jake had tried to tell him all those years ago. That courage isn't about being right, it's about being willing to be wrong. That strength isn't about standing alone, it's about letting others stand with you. That love doesn't come dressed the way we expect. Sometimes it rides a motorcycle and wears leather. Sometimes it looks like everything we were taught to fear. And sometimes, if we're brave enough to look past the surface, it becomes everything we never knew we needed. If you watched this far, it's because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories on this channel. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of someone you love, if it made you think about the second chances you've been given or the ones you still need to give, then please hit that like button. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel, join our family, because we're just getting started, and there are so many more stories to tell. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who might be struggling with judgment, with pride, with the fear of letting go. Because sometimes the best gift we can give is a reminder that it's never too late to change. Richard Coleman started this story as a man who thought he knew everything. He ended it as a grandfather who knew only one thing for certain: that love, freely given and freely received, is the only legacy that matters. And somewhere on the roads of Cedar Falls, the engines still rumble, the brotherhood still rides, and a little girl in a tiny leather vest dreams of the day she'll ride alongside them, her grandfather's key hanging around her neck, a reminder that family is who shows up. This is not just a story about bikers. This is not just a story about fathers and daughters. This is a story about all of us. About the walls we build and the bridges we burn. About the chances we miss and the ones we finally take. About the moment we realize that the people we feared might be the very people who save us. Richard learned that lesson. Daniel learned it too. And maybe, if you watched until the end, you learned something as well. The road is long. The journey is hard. But we don't have to walk it alone. That's the promise of family. That's the truth of brotherhood. And that's the hope that keeps us riding, no matter how dark the night. Until next time, remember, every stranger could be a friend, every enemy could be a brother, and every mistake could be the beginning of something beautiful. Keep watching, keep believing, keep loving, and never forget. Sometimes the people who look the most different from us are the ones who see us most clearly. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of this journey. Now go out there and make your own story. The engine is running, the road is waiting, and the ride has just begun. Richard walked out of the gala that night, Margaret on one arm, Lily asleep on his shoulder. The stars were bright above Cedar Falls, and the distant sound of motorcycles echoed through the streets. Jake and Emma followed behind, hands intertwined, their love a quiet testament to everything they had overcome. "Same time next year?" Jake asked. Richard smiled. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." They drove home through the sleeping town, past the hardware store, past the diner where two strangers had become family, past the church where bells still rang every Sunday. And Richard thought about all the years behind him and all the years ahead. He thought about the grandson or granddaughter that Emma had just announced was on the way. He thought about the charity rides and the Sunday dinners and the small moments that added up to a lifetime. He had wasted so much time. But time had a funny way of giving you exactly what you needed, exactly when you needed it. He had needed humility. He had received it. He had needed grace. He had been given it. He had needed family. And family had found him, in the most unexpected form, wearing leather and riding thunder. That night, Richard Coleman slept better than he had in years. And when he woke, the sun was shining, his granddaughter was giggling in the kitchen, and his son-in-law was making pancakes. Some mistakes take years to make right, but once they're made right, they shine brighter than anything else in the world. This was Richard's story, but it could be yours too. All you have to do is choose. Choose love over fear. Choose grace over judgment. Choose the open road over the closed door. And remember, always remember, that the people we push away might be the very people we need most. Richard Coleman learned that lesson. Now it's your turn. The end. But really, it's just the beginning. Because every ending is a new start. Every mistake is a new chance. And every person who watches this far is part of something bigger than any one story. You are part of this family now. Welcome home, and thank you for riding with us. The engines are quiet now, but they'll roar again tomorrow. And when they do, we'll be there. Together. Always. This is what brotherhood means. This is what love means. This is what it means to be human. Flawed. Broken. Beautiful. And never ever alone. Keep riding, keep loving, keep believing. And we'll see you on the next journey. Because the road never ends. It just keeps going. And so do we. Richard stood at his window the next morning, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Margaret joined him, her head resting against his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how wrong I was. About how right everything turned out. About how sometimes the universe gives us exactly what we need, even when we're too stubborn to ask for it." Margaret smiled. "You've changed, Richard." "I hope so. I really hope so." The phone rang. It was Emma. "Dad, Jake and I were wondering if you'd like to come over for breakfast. Lily's been asking for her grandpa." Richard felt his heart swell. "I'll be there in 15 minutes." He hung up the phone and looked at Margaret. "Coming?" She grabbed her coat. "Wouldn't miss it." They drove through Cedar Falls, past the familiar streets and storefronts, past the lives being lived behind every window. And Richard thought about all the stories happening all around him, all the struggles and triumphs and quiet moments of grace. He had been so focused on his own story that he had almost missed the most important chapters. But not anymore. Now he was present. Now he was paying attention. Now he was part of something larger than himself. And that, he realized, was the greatest gift of all. The house was warm when they arrived, filled with the smell of coffee and bacon and something sweet baking in the oven. Lily ran to meet them at the door, her arms outstretched. "Grandpa! Grandma! You came?" Richard scooped her up, spinning her around until she squealed with delight. "Of course we came, sweetheart. We'll always come." Jake appeared in the kitchen doorway, spatula in hand, an apron tied around his waist. He looked nothing like the fearsome biker Richard had once imagined. He looked like a father, like a husband, like family. "Pancakes are almost ready," Jake said. "Emma's setting the table." Richard set Lily down and walked toward his son-in-law. "Thank you," he said. Jake raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For not giving up on me. For seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself. For loving my daughter the way she deserves to be loved." Jake's expression softened. "That's what family does, Richard. We see each other through the hard times. We hold on even when it would be easier to let go." Richard nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I'm still learning that. Aren't we all?" They stood there for a moment, two men from different worlds who had found common ground in the only thing that truly mattered. Then Lily tugged at Richard's hand. "Grandpa, come see my drawings." And Richard let himself be led into the kitchen, into the warmth, into the family that had been waiting for him all along. Breakfast was chaos in the best possible way. Syrup was spilled, stories were told, and Lily entertained everyone with her interpretation of events from daycare that may or may not have actually happened that way. Emma caught Richard's eye across the table and smiled. "I'm glad you're here, Dad." "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." After breakfast, while Emma and Margaret cleaned up, Jake took Richard out to the garage. The motorcycles gleamed in the morning light, each one a story of its own. "I've been thinking," Jake said, "about what comes next." "What do you mean?" Jake leaned against his workbench. "The Brotherhood is growing. We're doing more charity work, reaching more people. And we need someone to help organize it all. Someone who knows business, who knows this community." Richard felt a spark of something in his chest. "Are you asking me to join officially?" Jake smiled. "I'm asking if you'd consider being our community liaison, coming to meetings, helping us plan events, connecting us with local businesses who want to support the cause." Richard thought about his hardware store, about the decades he had spent building something solid and real. And then he thought about the charity ride, about Marcus, about all the people who needed help and didn't know where to find it. "I'd be honored," he said. Jake extended his hand, and Richard shook it. "Welcome to the Brotherhood, Dad." The word hung in the air, unexpected and perfect. Dad. Richard felt tears prick his eyes for the 100th time that month. "You know, I never thought I'd hear you call me that." Jake's smile widened. "Neither did I. But here we are." Here they were indeed. Two men who had started as strangers, then enemies, then reluctant acquaintances, and now somehow family. It was the kind of transformation that Richard had once thought impossible. But then again, he had thought a lot of things were impossible. He had been wrong about most of them. The weeks turned into months, and Richard threw himself into his new role with the Brotherhood. He attended meetings, organized fundraisers, and connected the club with business owners who wanted to give back. He watched as the organization grew, as more families were helped, as more children received the support they needed. And through it all, he learned. He learned that the men he had once feared were some of the most generous people he had ever met. He learned that courage came in all forms, not just the ones he had been taught to recognize. He learned that family was a choice, made every day, in 1,000 small decisions. He learned that it was never too late to become the person you were meant to be. 1 year after the anniversary celebration, the Brotherhood hosted another charity gala. This time, Richard was one of the organizers. He stood at the entrance, greeting guests, his heart full of gratitude. Marcus was there, out of his wheelchair now, walking slowly but steadily with the help of a cane. His parents stood beside him, their faces radiant with joy. "Mr. Coleman," Daniel said, shaking Richard's hand. "I can't thank you enough, for everything." Richard smiled. "You don't need to thank me. You fought the fight. I just helped hold the flashlight." Daniel laughed. "That's one way to put it." Tank appeared beside them, a tray of appetizers in his massive hands. "Hey, boss, Emma's looking for you. Something about a speech?" Richard groaned. "I told her I'd say a few words, not give a speech." Tank grinned. "With this family, a few words always turns into a speech. Better get used to it." Richard made his way through the crowd, stopping to greet friends and neighbors, marveling at how much had changed in such a short time. A year ago, he had been standing on the outside, looking in. Now he was part of something. Something real. Something that mattered. He found Emma near the stage, clipboard in hand, the picture of organized efficiency. "There you are," she said. "You're on in 5 minutes. What am I supposed to say?" Emma put down her clipboard and took his hands. "Say what's in your heart, Dad. That's all anyone ever needs to hear." Richard looked at his daughter, at the woman she had become, and felt a wave of pride so strong it nearly knocked him over. "I love you," he said. "Have I told you that enough?" Emma's eyes glistened. "You've told me, but I never get tired of hearing it." They embraced, father and daughter, and when they pulled apart, Richard was ready. He climbed the steps to the stage, looking out at the sea of faces. He saw Margaret in the front row, her smile encouraging. He saw Jake holding Lily, who waved enthusiastically. He saw Tank and the other brothers, standing tall and proud. He saw Marcus and his family, living proof that hope was not just a word. And he spoke from the heart. 5 years ago, I made a decision that almost cost me everything. I judged someone I didn't know, feared something I didn't understand, and pushed away the people I loved most. I thought I was protecting my family. Instead, I was breaking it. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But I got a second chance. Not because I deserved it, but because the people around me believed I could do better. My daughter believed in me. My son-in-law believed in me. This entire community believed in me. He looked at Jake, who nodded slowly. And that's what the Iron Brotherhood is all about. Second chances. Not just for the families we help, but for all of us. For the veterans who come home and don't know how to fit in anymore. For the parents who are fighting battles they never expected. For the grandparents who almost missed out on the greatest joy of their lives. Lily chose that moment to shout, "That's my grandpa!" The crowd laughed, and Richard felt his heart overflow. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm your grandpa, and there's nothing in this world I'm prouder of." He took a deep breath. So tonight, as we celebrate another successful year, as we remember the families we've helped and look forward to helping more, I want to say thank you. Thank you for welcoming me. Thank you for teaching me. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to ride in a new direction. He raised his glass. To second chances, to family, to the open road, and to all of you who make this journey worthwhile. The crowd raised their glasses in response, and the gala erupted in cheers. Richard stepped off the stage and into the arms of his family. Margaret kissed his cheek, Emma squeezed his hand, and Jake clapped him on the shoulder. "Not bad," Jake said. "For a hardware store guy." Richard laughed. "I had a good teacher." Lily squirmed in Jake's arms, reaching for her grandfather. "Grandpa, will you dance with me again?" Richard took her, settling her on his hip. "Always, sweetheart. Always." And as the music started and the lights dimmed, Richard Coleman danced with his granddaughter in the middle of a warehouse filled with bikers, surrounded by a family he had almost lost, grateful for every single moment. Because that's what life was, really. A collection of moments. Some we wasted, some we treasured, and some, if we were very lucky, we got to live twice. Richard had wasted a lot of moments, but he was done with that now. From here on out, he would live every single one. The dance ended, and Lily demanded ice cream, and the night continued in its beautiful, chaotic way. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Richard found a quiet corner and just watched. He watched his daughter laugh at something Jake said. He watched his wife chat with the other Brotherhood wives, making plans for the next community event. He watched Tank sneak extra desserts to the children when he thought no one was looking, and he thought about the journey that had brought him here. It had started with fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of losing control, fear of a man in leather who didn't fit the mold Richard had created. But fear was just a starting point. It didn't have to be the ending. He had chosen differently. He had chosen to listen, to learn, to let go of the certainty that had kept him trapped. And in return, he had received more than he had ever imagined. A son, a granddaughter, a brotherhood, a purpose. A family that was bigger than blood and stronger than prejudice. Richard took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the sounds and smells of the gala. The laughter, the music, the clinking of glasses, the rumble of engines outside as late arrivals pulled into the parking lot. This was his life now. This was his home, and he wouldn't trade it for anything. The final scene played out the way all the best stories do, not with fireworks or grand gestures, but with the small, quiet moments that mean everything. Richard and Margaret drove home that night, the windows down, the cool air rushing past. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. When they pulled into their driveway, the house looked the same as it always had. 2 stories, wraparound porch, garden that Margaret tended with love. But Richard saw it differently now. He saw the chair where Lily liked to sit when she came to visit. He saw the workshop where he was building her a dollhouse for Christmas. He saw the photo on the mantle of their first family dinner together. All 5 of them crowded around a table too small for the love it held. Margaret took his hand as they walked to the door. "Happy?" she asked. Richard thought about the question. He thought about everything he had lost and everything he had gained. He thought about the man he had been and the man he was becoming. "Happy," he confirmed. Finally. They went inside, and the door closed behind them, and the lights of the Coleman house glowed warm against the Ohio night. And somewhere across town, Jake Morrison tucked his daughter into bed, kissed his wife goodnight, and sat on the porch of the home he had built, listening to the distant sounds of engines. He thought about the father-in-law who had once forbidden his love. He thought about the grandfather who now couldn't stay away. He thought about the strange winding road that had brought them all together. And he smiled, because that was the thing about roads. You never knew where they would lead, but if you were brave enough to ride them, they usually took you exactly where you needed to go. Jake raised his eyes to the stars, scattered like promises across the dark sky. "Thank you," he whispered, to no one and everyone. Then he went inside, and the night settled over Cedar Falls, and another chapter ended. But the story continued. It always does. Because families don't end. They just keep growing, keep changing, keep becoming something new. That's the lesson Richard Coleman learned. That's the truth Jake Morrison lived, and that's the gift they gave to each other and to everyone who watched their story unfold. Family is who shows up. Love is what we choose. And second chances are the most precious gifts we can ever receive. This was their story. Thank you for being part of it. Now go write your own. The road is waiting, and the ride has just begun.